Hello everyone. In our previous lecture, we discussed what relationships are and how relationships can be classified based on their degrees such as unary, binary, ternary and n-ary relationships. Now, there is another important way of understanding the relationships based on their dependency between the entity types involved. So from this perspective, relationships can be broadly classified into strong relationships and weak or identifying relationship. So let us understand what a strong relationship is with the help of an example. So a strong relationship exists between strong entity types. I think we have discussed this in our previous lectures, but let's revise it once again. So in the strong relationship, each entity type they can exist independently and it has its own primary key. For example, here you can see two entity types, the student entity type and the course entity type. So the student entity type has its own primary key called the S number, and the course entity type has its own primary key called C number. This means that the student they can exist independently of the course entity type, and the course entity type can also exist independently of the student entity type. The relationship between these two entity types is enrolls in. So a student can enroll in one course, but the existence of a course does not depend on the existence of a particular student. And similarly, the student does not cease to exist just because they are not enrolled in any particular course. Therefore, this is an example of strong relationship between strong entities. Here you can see 1 and n. These are called the cardinalities. One student can enroll in multiple courses and each course can have only one student enrolled. We will study about cardinality in the next lecture, but the important point in this lecture is that both the entity types they have independent identities and they have different primary keys. Next, we move to the weak relationship. It is also called the identifying relationship. Now, let us see the example over here. The student is a strong entity type. Why? Because it has its own primary key called the S number. And then you see another entity type called as the guardian entity type. But it is a weak entity type. The important question is why guardian is a weak entity type. A weak entity does not have its own complete key. So unlike the S number over here we don't have a separate key attribute. So thus a weak entity type does not have a complete key of its own that is sufficient to uniquely identify it independently. Its identification depends on the association with the strong entity type, also called the owner entity type. So here for the guardian entity type, the strong entity type is the student or the owner entity type is the student entity type. In this example, this guardian is identified in association with the particular student. For example, there is a school festival and you are accompanied with your guardian. So can these guardian they come into the school without any student? No, they have to be associated with one or the other student. Therefore, this guardian entity type is dependent on the student entity type. And if we remove the student, that is the owner entity type, the guardian record cannot be meaningfully identified within this model. You can identify the weak entity type using a double rectangle. Now we have discussed about the strong entity type and the weak entity type. We have already seen this in our previous lecture. Here you see a double diamond shape. You can also identify this type of relationship from its notation. A normal relationship is represented using a single diamond, but an identifying relationship which connects a weak entity type to its owner entity type is represented using a double diamond. So the double diamond tells us that the relationship is not just an ordinary relationship, but it plays an important role in identifying the weak entity type. So having seen this, what is the fundamental difference between the strong relationship and a weak relationship is, in a strong relationship, the participating entities are independently identifiable. Here you can see the student and the course, they are independent entity types. And each strong entity type has its own primary key and they can exist independently. But in the weak or identifying relationship, one entity type, that is the weak entity type, depends on the another entity type called as the owner or the strong entity type for its identification and existence in the database model. Let's take another real life example. Consider an employee and the department. So both the employee and the department, they can exist independently. An employee has an employee ID, a department has a department ID. So this is a typical strong relationship identified by a single diamond. Now consider employee entity type and dependent entity type. A dependent such as a child or spouse recorded for an employee may be represented as a weak entity type in the database design. The dependent is associated with a particular employee and its identification can depend on the employee's key along with the partial key of the dependent. So this has already been showcased in the previous lecture. You can go through the lecture of the strong entity type versus weak entity type. Just remember three things. The first is a strong entity type has its own key and can exist independently. Second, a weak entity type depends on the strong entity type or the owner entity type for its identification. The third point is a strong relationship is identified using a single diamond, whereas an identifying or the weak relationship is showcased with a double diamond. In the next lecture, we will study about the cardinalities of the relationship. Hope you remember 1:n. So thank you and we will meet in the next lecture. Bye bye.